Hello everybody and welcome to lesson 4. My son is still homesick, but I'm teaching today, so I came in to try and make you guys this quick video. So what I want to do is just kind of go over a little bit of last week and get us to thinking about this week. So last week we were really trying to focus on the optimistic perspective of technology and think about technology as a societal good. I paired Brey with Collins and Halverson's chapter for a reason. The main thing is that if you read the Collins and Halverson chapter on the optimist's perspective of technology, it's pointing out all the ways in which technology can enhance or support learning or change learning in a formal learning context. Now, a lot of these things happen to be ways to improve sort of cognitive thought processes. So learner control, right? Having a learner be able to control what they want, having just-in-time learning, being able to connect with others even. It's really to talk about course concepts and things of that nature. And so as we were thinking about that, I wanted you to put it into and think about the perspective of where Brey was coming from. And Brey was really trying to think about how we think about and evaluate technology, not with regards to whether it can help us to accomplish one specific task or learn one specific thing, but more from a meta perspective of how is the technology helping us to have basically better qualities of life. So he was focusing on things like justice, freedom, well-being, right? Those types of things, which I think are often ignored. Interestingly, it's very similar to conversations which are happening politically with regards to how we measure progress in the United States. We have GDP, which is GDP, the gross domestic product. I almost confused it with the gross national product. But anyways, and basically it's a very sort of materialistic and economic way of measuring how well a country is doing, but it's really just focusing on the products that it's produced and the money that it's made and things of that nature. And some people have argued that that may be a very old-fashioned way of measuring the health of a country, and that we should be looking at some of the things that Brey talks about, like sustainability, like what is the health of our water system, what is the health of our air, how happy are people in the country? What is the general sort of mental well-being of people who are living here? Those types of measures, people are arguing, are becoming increasingly important now that we have such a complex society. If we're only focusing on very specific, narrow outcomes, we might miss a lot of very important things that could lead to our downfall later on, right? So if we're only focused on how much we are producing and selling, but we're not paying attention to how quickly we're burning through our natural resources, that could very greatly hinder our ability to be producing things later on. And so there's a lot of economic things which might actually be connected to some of these more social and environmental things which we're not measuring. Well, the same is true when we think about the health and well-being of learners in a classroom. If we are only focusing on measuring a very sort of small and narrow aspect like test scores, we may actually miss out on some very important things like the socio-emotional well-being of children and adult learners, and their ability to engage with or be interested in complex problems, those types of things that are very difficult to measure. And so that's kind of where I was pushing with last week. I think there were some really interesting discussions that ensued from that combination of papers and talk. I really enjoyed reading through all the VMware posts. And one of the things that came up is a discussion of, how do we push for more socially oriented, equitable, and just integration of technologies into a classroom. Is this something that needs to be legislated? Is this something that needs to be modeled? These are important questions to ask. Now, as a teacher or as an instructor or as a designer, a lot of the decision making is going to be falling upon you to make these types of decisions. And so this week we go to the other end, to the dark side, if you will. Now, you notice that in the book, I'm having you skip chapters 4 and 5. You're going from chapter 3, which is the technology skeptics argument. And this argument, I think, primarily focuses not necessarily on the negative or potential repercussions of technology, but more on the different systemic factors that can interfere with technology actually transforming how we teach and learn. There are other factors which the chapter does not get into, which I hope to supplement with some of the talks which I have there for you to look at. Now, I skipped chapter 4. Chapter 4 is really interesting. Chapter 4 really sort of is a historical chapter that really lays down how our school system came to be what it is today. That is really interesting because it helps to explain a lot of these systemic factors and obstacles that are now interfering with the ability for us to change and reform education. So I highly recommend that chapter. It's really, really interesting. I just didn't want to require it because it's not super necessary to be able to understand the rest of the stuff. Nonetheless, you got time, skim it. It's a really, really interesting chapter. And then I skipped chapter 5. We're going to come back to chapter 5, which is planting the seeds of a new education system in part 2 of the course, when we start focusing on examples of using technology to support, transform, and enhance learning. But for now, I wanted you to go to chapter 7, which is in keeping with last week and this week, right? So last week we're looking at different benefits and potential ways in which technology can help society. And this week we're going to be looking at all the potential downsides. And then with chapter 7, it'll be a way to push you and prompt you to really analyze the potential trade-offs that could come from sort of establishing new ways of thinking and new ways of teaching and new ways of learning, right? There are things to be gained and there are things to be lost. And it's really important that we think about those things. Okay. So that sort of lays out sort of last week and this week, a couple of things that I wanted to talk about for this week. As I said, some of the things that he does not mention are things like the ways in which technology is impacting us on a more systemic level. And this touches back on Brey. So Brey, the way that he described the impacts of technology on culture, he was really pushing you to engage in systems thinking. He's showing you how small individual changes can lead to more, larger changes within the group or organization, and how those can then over time and collectively add to macro changes, which are sort of bigger societal, cultural changes that are occurring. Well, some of the talks that I have for you to look at and read are doing that, but from a more critical perspective. And so the Abelson and Leiden one, From Blown to Bits, it's a chapter. This book is available free online. It's really, really interesting. The reason why I'd like for folks to take a look at it, particularly teachers, is because it talks about the ways in which technology is storing, sharing, and creating information, and the potential negative consequences that could have generationally. And so it's a very interesting read. I highly recommend that. And the entire book, as I said, is available. And then there's some really interesting talks with regards to the impacts that technology may be having. And so Team Human, this one is really looking at ways in which we can ensure that we're creating technology to work alongside people rather than make some of the things that we do obsolete. Connected but Alone, highly recommended. I really like this woman's books. They're very fascinating. Many of her books are really pushing this argument that the ways in which we are designing and creating technologies and the ways in which we are infusing technology in everything that we do is actually creating obstacles for people to connect with each other on a deeper and more personal level. And she argues that this has impacts on children as well. And so these are important things to consider. Now, does this mean that all technology is bad? No, but it's important that we understand that technology could pose potential problems, because then when we design activities or decide which technologies to incorporate and how, we can do so in a way that mitigates these types of problems. Sherry's is really, really interesting. If you're a parent, I highly recommend hers as well. And then there is we're building a dystopia just to get people to click on ads. I mean, I've watched all of these because I can't tell you how many of these I watched before I decided which were the most interesting to give to you. And so honestly, if you have time and you can't watch all these for my class, you should watch some of these at some point, because many of these talks are really important and critical things for us to consider, not just as educators and instructors and students, but just civically, as people who are part of this technologically driven society. So again, good luck deciding which ones to watch. Of course, you're free to watch them all, but you need to at least pick one of them and then, have them go along with the readings. Now, for This Week in Yammer, it would be great if you did talk a little bit about what you watch, because you're all going to be watching different things, and, share sort of the main takeaway moments, questions, to get us all sort of thinking more deeply about the ways in which technology might be impacting our society, okay? So that's what we're going to be doing this week. We're really, really thinking about the potential downsides of incorporating technology. And while the book is focusing primarily in sort of K-12 and maybe even some higher ed classrooms, I'm also helping us to think about this more on a macro scale, and so that we can look at what these systemic changes might mean collectively. So that's going to be lesson 4, and just to give you sort of a heads up for next week. Next week is lesson 5. We're stepping back from the Collins and Halverson, and we're looking at some, we're not stepping back from Collins and Halverson because we are going to be doing chapter 8, but we're going to be looking at some specific examples of how technologies can be integrated in schools. Part of the reason why we're doing this is because next week we're going to be wrapping up part 1 of the course, and so keep that in mind. If you're behind on any readings, make sure that you're going to be catching up, because once we get to part 6 of the course, lesson 6, you are going to be having your group discussion. So please remember that next week you do have the readings. You're going to have your reading questions activity next week, so make sure that you schedule time accordingly for next week so that you get that done. And then in the week that follows, you're going to be doing your first team discussion activity, and I'll make sure to follow up with that and make sure that you all know what to do and share some stuff to get you sort of oriented into the environment. All right, everybody, have a wonderful week, and I will see your thoughts next week for the reading questions activity. Take care. Bye.